Consider for a second what the great limiters of exercise performance are. What actually stops us from continuing to run, to go faster, to have more endurance? Now, as you start to think through this, you may go back to sort of some of the same considerations we've had in exercise science from the very beginning. If you look at the Harvard Fatigue Lab, the first exercise science lab on the planet, they were concerned about what these limiters are. If you go before that, let's talk about expeditions or explorations of the world. We're trying to be Ernest Shackleton, trying to get across the Antarctic on foot. And we need to know what the limiters are. What is going to stop humans from being able to do these miraculous things? Now, as you think about this, you probably come to the same conclusion that many people have come to before, that one of the limiters of performance is oxygen. Humans need oxygen to be able to metabolize food, to have these metabolic processes up and running, to use their bioenergetic systems for long periods of time, and even for short amounts of time, they need oxygen. So this is where we start to consider this. So VO2 max, and VO2 is probably a term you've heard me talk about in videos before. And it's this idea that how much oxygen can we actually uptake and bring into our system and then utilize. So if you, for example, can't actually deliver the oxygen to your working muscle, then it's not very useful, right? Even if you breathe it in, but you can't deliver it to where you want, that's a limiter. You have to actually have the hemoglobin, the myoglobin, all the pieces needed to take this oxygen molecules and get them to the place where you need them. Once they're there, do you have the mitochondria to process them? Do you have the ability to use this oxygen and process this oxygen? Well, that's what VO2 is. Now, at the max, the velocity of oxygen that you can uptake at max is what we call VO2 max. Now, this is a turning point for us in our physiology. But the reality is most of the time, if we're exercising at some form of submax, or we're shooting over our VO2 max, where we're placing demands on our body that are greater than the oxygen that we can actually bring in. So this percent of VO2 max is a great indicator of effort. So let's look at it here. We have these metabolic responses to incremental exercise. Oxygen uptake is going to increase linearly until VO2 max is achieved. So what this means is basically if we're working at, take this, where we have our watts here. So watts is a measure of power. So if we're sitting at 50 watts, then you don't need a lot of VO2. It's maybe for a young, healthy person, that's just a slow pedal on a bike. Now, as we start to go adding 50 watts after 50 watts after 50 watts after 50 watts, we're seeing the actual velocity of oxygen increase. So we have oxygen is going up, 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 and we're able to deliver it faster, faster, faster. We're going through our processes faster, and then at some point, eventually we hit a breaking point. We are delivering oxygen as fast as we possibly can. And after that, even if you go into more and more intense exercise, no more oxygen is being delivered. And that point is VO2 max, where you just plateau. You're delivering oxygen as fast as you possibly can. And this is a physiological ceiling. This is a limiter of exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, is how well can you deliver that oxygen to the muscle. Now, it's going to be roughly 50% genetically determined and 50% training or other factors determined. So someone with a high VO2 max is going to be probably, like, especially at very, very high levels, is going to be genetically blessed, along with having a high training output where they're really training at a high level. But you'll see a lot of endurance athletes in particular track their VO2 max. It's even built into smartwatches now, or GPS watches that they use for training, where it's giving you a prediction of VO2 max. The prediction's based off an algorithm. It's rough. It's sometimes right, a lot of times wrong, at least the ones on the watch. So that's why we have equipment in the lab like this thing behind me here, which is a metabolic cart. Or we also have portable versions that you'll see me use in some other videos. But this metabolic responses, or VO2, is important. So physiological factors that influence VO2 max is, again, the ability to deliver oxygen. Can the cardiorespiratory system, can you breathe it in? And can the blood pump it and carry it to where it needs to go? And then once it gets the muscles or the tissues that are working, can they use that oxygen? Do they have the pieces, the physiological systems in place to use it well? And can they produce ATP aerobically? So how much ATP, how can they produce through aerobic means? How much oxygen can be delivered? Are these systems nice and smooth? But the combination of both the delivery and the ability to use it determines VO2 max. So, as we do a VO2 max test, and you'll see a video where I did a VO2 max test, and be on the lookout for this. I'll give you a hint in a second. I did not hit my true VO2 max in it. One of these was not present. But as far as what is the true VO2 max, you need a plateau in oxygen consumption with increased work rate. So this is one sign. So if oxygen consumption levels off and they're working harder and harder, then that means they hit VO2 max. You'll see this occasionally, often in more trained athletes, where they're able to push past the point where they can't deliver oxygen and continue working for a period of time beyond that. For most people, when they hit their VO2 max, they're done. Like, they aren't pushing any farther. There's not a higher work rate. That's all they can handle. They get off the treadmill, they get off the bike, whatever they're doing, they stop. Because they can't push beyond once they get to this maximum oxygen consumption. A more common one is reaching age-predicted heart rate max. So for me, I am 27. So the classic formula there is 220 minus age. So my predicted heart rate max is 193. So be on the lookout. Did I get to 183 to 203 range? If I did, then it was probably a true max. If I did not, then it was probably a miss. I didn't push all the way. In this case, I was alone in the lab. For safety reasons, I did not push all the way. So you'll see that my heart rate, the max heart rate that I was steadily at, was 180. So I missed it by just slightly. Achieving blood lactate, so we can take a lactate measure immediately after. If it's 8 millimoles or higher, that's a good sign of VO2 max. Another one is RER. And the data that I provide in my other video, you aren't going to see RER. RER is this ratio of oxygen to CO2. How much oxygen are you breathing in versus CO2 out? So 1-to-1 is oxygen and CO2 are the same. Once you get to 1.15 or higher, or I've heard it as 1.1 or higher, you'll see where CO2 is being produced quicker than oxygen is coming in. And that's a good sign of hitting true VO2 max. So again, here's that RER measure, sometimes just R. You have CO2 up above divided by O2. Hence, if CO2 is higher than O2, you have more byproduct, and then you have useful gas. Then you're going to end up with something at 1.0, 1.1, 1.15, maybe even up to like 1.2. Now, another thing is we're going to measure exercise only in a steady state. So we've talked about the steady state where you sort of plateau. You increase intensity and then you plateau. Your heart rate plateaus, your breathing plateaus, but you have to get to a plateau. You have to get to a steady state for the measurements to be accurate in a VO2 test. So in this case, what we can do is we can take this CO2 and this O2 and this value to predict fuel utilization pretty accurately, right? Because we know byproducts of different systems. If we burn a carb, we're going to produce this much CO2. If we burn a fat, we're going to produce this much CO2. So when you start out, someone might be at a lower value, which is going to signal that they're burning fats if their RER is lower. Now, if they get to 1.0 or higher, then they're burning almost 100% carbohydrates because we're producing more CO2 than O2. And here's how we get that. So we start out at 0.7 as I'm sitting here. I'm not strapped up to the machine, but I would guess I'm sitting at about 0.7. Reason for that is if we break down a fat, here's what a fat looks like. We add oxygen to it, and we go through this chemical process, and we end up with CO2 and water as a byproduct. So if we measure the CO2 someone is breathing out versus the oxygen that they're breathing in, so we have 23 molecules of oxygen, 16 CO2s, so 16 divided by 23, it's going to get us at 0.7. Now with glucose, on the other hand, you have 6 CO2 or 6 oxygen coming in, 6 CO2 coming out, which gets us to 1.0. Once you get up to 1.1, 1.15, that's where we have all this CO2 is building up and being released sort of together and overshooting, which is a normal thing, but it's definitely going to signal 100% carbohydrates or higher. But our ratio is between 0.7 and 0.1, or between 0.7 and 1.0 is going to determine carbs versus fat utilization. So we can see that here, where once we get to 0.85 or 50-50, we can also see how many calories are being burned of each. So we know this uptake of oxygen is important for performance, right? We need it to deliver oxygen so that we can perform well and we can use our bioenergetic systems. But VO2 is also a great predictor of health. Someone who is aging, if they are able to get a higher VO2 max, then they have a higher capacity to work. So everything you do requires a certain VO2. If you want to run there's a big campaign to get a human under 2 hours in the marathon. It's been done already in a very highly controlled environment, but to get a human in a record legal course under 2 hours is this big campaign. So we have all these calculations that have been done of what it would take to get someone under 2 hours. So we know that it would require a VO2 or VO2 max of a certain value. And we also know that at a comfortable pace, at a marathon pace, someone would also need to be at a certain percent of this value to be able to actually break 2 hours. Likewise, if you are going to walk from your couch to your bedroom, we know there's a certain level of VO2 that's necessary and a certain percent of that VO2 you would have to handle. So every activity you do, whether it's day-to-day living or this extremes of human performance, requires a certain amount of VO2. So if we take an elderly patient, then VO2 is going to be a great predictor of their cardiovascular health. Are they going to be able to get the oxygen that they need to utilize in order to perform on a day-to-day basis of just survival? Not performance, just survival, right? So what we end up with is this wide range of humans that are interested in what their VO2 values are. So you would have a elite athlete, and then you would have someone who is very much struggling. So you can do these predictions for different people, but there's maximal and submaximal testing. If we do maximal testing, we're going to get an accurate result, right? We're going to put them to their limit. They're going to hit their VO2 max, and they're going to not be any doubt in your minds. You know exactly what their VO2 max is. Now, with that said, though, do you want to take someone who just had a heart attack and put them to their max? No, not logical, right? So we have this submaximal testing where we can put someone at a lower than maximal rate and see what changes they've had from rest to the submax rate and use that to predict what their max rate would be. So these are usually going to be quicker, and they're going to be easier, and they're going to be safer, but they're going to be less accurate. So with maximal testing, very, very accurate. It's very sensitive to signs of cardiovascular issues, but you probably need a doctor present unless you have a very healthy individual. There are risks involved. Someone might have a cardiovascular event when they're put to their max, and they're also going to be fatigued. Whether it's an elite athlete or an elderly person, if they go to their VO2 max, there's going to be some degree of fatigue involved because it's an all-out effort. Now with submaximal, on the other hand, you have the opposite. Lower risk, but you lose accuracy. So there's this trade-off between accuracy and safety. Each is going to have a different value. And another helpful thing is submax is less expensive. You can run a submax at home. In fact, you probably will have to do that for the course. But in maximal testing, you need specialized lab equipment like the Met cart behind me or a portable VO2 system. So if we're doing submax, though, we have to run off some basic assumptions. One of which is that people will have a roughly the same heart rate max of similar demographics. So like I said, 220 minus age is a great predictor. Most people are plus or minus 10 beats of that. So we can utilize that as a predictor. With that said, though, heart rate maxes do vary. We can kind of assume that they won't, but there are scenarios where certain people are going to have a higher heart rate max or a lower heart rate max than comparable individuals. A steady state heart rate is obtained. Again, you got to hit the steady state, because if we take a snapshot of where someone is physiologically, but they're still climbing the hill, they're still ramping up their heart rate, they're still ramping up their oxygen consumption, and that's not really helpful. Another one with submaxes, they rely heavily off heart rates. So a heart rate is going to be pretty linear with VO2, generally speaking. But with that said, you will see a little bit shift where the line, even if it is linear, the actual points are coming slightly above or below the line. But we lose some accuracy there, but generally we can make this assumption. Another is mechanical efficiency is consistent for all subjects. That's probably a smaller assumption. It is going to differ, which is going to cause some variance in submax predictions. So here's some example tests. First one is a non-exercise test called the University of Houston test. You rate your physical activity from 0 to 7, and then it takes your age, BMI, that rating you gave yourself, and an equation, pieces those together, it gives you a prediction. Super simple, probably not as accurate, right? No exercise involved. 3-minute step test uses recovery heart rate. You set a metronome at 90 beats per minute. You go up, down, up. Well, you go up, up, down, down, up, down, down. Go from the step over and over and over again. You throw those numbers into a calculator, and guess what? It's going to predict your VO2 max. So you do your up, up, down, down for 3 minutes, and then you sit down for 15 seconds, and then the next 15 seconds from minute 3:15 to minute 3:30, you will measure your heart rate. Take the number that you count on your carotid, multiply that by 4 since it's a 15-second measure, and then you can put that into the equation. Next one's the Ebeling single-stage treadmill walking test. Predict their heart rate max. Warm up for 4 minutes. 0% grade and between 3.4 to 4.0. Take their heart rate on the carotid or their what is that? The ulnar or no radial? Radial artery. And that's at the first minute warm up. Get their heart rate between 50 to 70% of predicted HR max. At 1 minute, then stay at that speed, and then remeasure heart rate at 2 minutes. After the 4th minute of warm-up, same speed as warm-up, increase grade to 5%, and then you go another 4 minutes. Measure heart rate at 230, 330. If these two heart rates are within 5 beats per minute, which is going to indicate a steady state, then you'll go ahead and stop the test. If not, you continue exercising for another minute and then remeasure the heart rate. The average of the final 2 heart rates, again, the steady state heart rate, is going to estimate VO2 max based off of an equation. Now, the YMCA cycle test is another one. Popular test for estimating VO2 max based on the concept that both heart rate and VO2 progress linearly. Uses 2 to 4 3-minute stages of continuous exercise, and you need 2 consecutive stages where heart rate is within 110 to 150 beats per minute. So here's our procedures. Get the age and weight, run some, predict their max heart rate, pedal at 50 RPM through the entire test, which you can set a metronome to 100 where, down pedal, down pedal, down pedal, down pedal is at each beat. Warm up for 2 minutes at 25 watts. Everyone starts at the same workload as warm up. Heart rate at end of first 3-minute stage determines following stages. So if you get there, heart rate must be between 6 beats per minute to be considered steady state. If not, continue at the same work rate for another minute or longer until you do get to steady state. Measure heart rate during each stage, and participant continues until they have at least 2 stages where heart rate is greater than 110. And then you take those values, put into the prediction chart to estimate VO2 max. So looks a little bit like this. I'll pause this if you want to look at it for a second, if you want to pause the video. Okay, so as you saw, it split into different categories based off of where their heart rate was between the first stage. Someone with a lower heart rate, it's going to end up with a higher work rate versus someone with a higher heart rate after warm up. stays generally pretty calm work rate. And then from there, you take those numbers, you plot them out, you draw lines, and from there we can go across, and we can make the predicted VO2 max using the directions here. Now, another thing, and you'll see I did this in a video that'll be posted. But there's this max test, right? So max test, basically we're just trying to get someone to their maximal aerobic effort. It's easier, shorter time period, generally if we increase both grade and pace. So what you'll see as you watch the video is the pace is never particularly quick, right? So I think I made it, I don't know, either fifth or sixth stage. This is called a Bruce protocol. You can use time survived on a Bruce protocol to do a submax prediction as well. But for this, the max test, I use this. Starts with a nice little warm-up where you're going real slow walk. You're walking uphill. I think the exact protocol I did is... Yeah, it starts at 1.7 and 10% grade. So I started right here because I've done a warm-up on my own. Really easy. You're going uphill. You walk a little faster uphill, walk a little faster. Then there's this awkward point, this inflection point, and then we're going to have where it climbs more and more and more. So as you climb and you start running a little bit harder, eventually someone's going to just get to this point of where they can't go any farther. That's the VO2 max. You measure it using gas exchange, and we get a good idea, a very good idea of what their VO2 max is if they actually truly push to the end. So if you have any questions about this, look through the other videos that I'll make, and then feel free to ask your instructor as well.